So as government is thinking about security, we touched a little bit on compliance. There are ways that we're trying to secure our applications, including the ATO. So with that, I'd like to invite our panel on automated ATOs, Revamped, TIC, and beyond. So if the panel would come up, and we'll start with a couple of minutes from Greg, then Nate and Scott, and then we'll have a facilitated dialogue. So let me just hand one over.
I think I need to stand here just so I can. Should I be holding? Yeah.
I just want to point out that Nate's wearing a tie and a suit in his picture. Does that count?
So I'm gonna try to do 5 to 7 minutes. I'm gonna try to keep it at 5 around why the NIST risk management framework is hard for the cloud and what to do about it, and kind of really talking about it. So just a quick bit about me. I used to be the chief data officer at the Federal Communication Commission, so I'm really a data guy, and I got very frustrated by the ATO process. It was the bottleneck on everything that we did. Left the government and have been working and getting some support from DHS&T to try to speed up the process. So what I'm going to share with you is what we've learned through our research and the work we've done. So the first thing is, I love compliance. And I think that you guys should love compliance too, right? Compliance is awesome. Compliance is why compliance is adherence to a standard. It's why Bluetooth works. It's why the internet works. It's why Wi-Fi works, right? The other thing is compliance is what human beings use as a technique for attestation and verification at scale. How do I know that this building is safe? Because throughout the entire supply chain, there are different people checking the pieces, the material, the design, and everything aspect of it, because there's no way that I could determine on my own if this building is safe for this many people to be in. That's compliance. And so ultimately, in the same way that brakes allow us to go faster, the idea that I know that you are adhering to a standard allows us to work together and saves us time, versus if I don't know that you're adhering to the standard. And the most important thing here is compliance is not security, right? It's an entirely different discipline. It's a discipline of, once you know what the right practice is, compliance is about scaling that practice to very large numbers. So it's an entirely different subject manager. So also just quickly, Beyonce, Greg. Beyonce, Greg. So whenever you think of Beyonce, think of Greg. Okay. So why is the NIST risk management framework so hard for the cloud? It was written before the cloud happened, right? It came out just before AWS, and back in that era, multi-year dev ship cycles were very common, servers were permanent, and of course you had an MOU for every interconnect that you did. So it's a very different world that it came out. So the problem isn't that we hate compliance, we just hate a bad compliance process, right? So the other thing is that the NIST 853 assumes that every IT system is bespoke and is its own snowflake, when increasingly and so it provides very high level general guidance about what to do. It assumes that if you connect to the system over a network, that's very special. So and that it's your own hardware, which is not the world that we live in either. The tools that we have in place, like EMAS and CSAM and Telos Exacta, these work on the model when compliance first came out. They aggregate around controls, so they're not in touch with the world that we live in. So it's an older world. So how do we begin to deal with this? We already address this all the time when it comes to software. We use package management. And at the heart of the software that we build today, at the heart of the CSP in the cloud, is the idea of reuse, 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 right? And so all of us are probably familiar with basically dependency files, or manifests, and being able to describe that. That's how we deal with reuse in our software world today and how we create it. And that's what we want to do actually when it comes to compliance, right? We don't want to be writing control information or SSPs by hand. We want to be assembling them from pieces. So if this is how we do it, you can see how it looks like. There's a community standard that was developed, Open Control, and you can see on the left, it looks a lot like a, if you can read that text, but it looks a lot like any other dependency file, where I'm basically saying, hey, I am using this particular package. These are the controls that are associated with that package, so I can get it. So let me, so basically what we're saying is that the ATO, in order to speed it up, we need to industrialize it just like we've industrialized the rest of our infrastructure. That means we have a compliant supply chain of pre-written control narratives, of predefined evidence types, and predefined testing routines. I think I'm doing okay on time? Okay, I'm doing, all right, so what's not reusable is how we create control documentation today, where we start with the control. We start with the control like SC7 boundary protection, and we say that our IT system boundary protection is satisfied because I'm using a Cisco firewall or because I'm using Azure, and that's what's controlling it. So that's a non-reusable description because we munge all this stuff together. This is the big concept, folks. Go the other way. Start with the component. And if we have a component, and if it's configured correctly, that component always gives us the same set of controls for the same type of IT system. If we're using a Cisco firewall, it's configured correctly, it gives us the same type of controls. If we're going to, you're going to hear about blueprints. If I've configured correctly in Microsoft Azure, I'm inheriting a set of controls. We already have the model of control inheritance as part of the risk management framework. What we're saying is that it doesn't just go down to a big system like Azure, it goes to every component in your stack and every part of your organization. Okay, so what does that look like? You take a product like Ion Channel that does software supply chain. Ion Channel actually contributes to all of these different controls. Right? Some of them it does completely, some of it contributes to. So every component is associated with a set of controls. Here's an example of an open control YAML file. If you can see what's going on, at number 1, I've kind of named the component, which is Docker's Universal Control Plane. At number 2, I'm saying that it satisfies control key AC3 that's a part of the NIST 853 standard. You look down to number 3, and there's the narrative text of how UCP, when properly configured, actually gives me the control. This is YAML, so it means I now have a machine-readable component security plan. And if all of my components have a machine-readable component security plan, then my entire system can have a machine-readable system security plan that can be assembled automatically. Any questions? I'm doing okay? It's making sense? Right. These are the underlying concepts. Open control is one implementation of it. We at GovReady, we've done a slightly different implementation. The key thing that we worked on is that we recognize that there's a relationship between a component and control, but that relationship is dynamic depending on how things are configured. So what we want to have is a reusable data asset that represents a set of questions, has an API, business rules, and templates in order to produce the content that's in the SSP. Now that we have these machine-readable, reusable component asset plans, we can describe system security according to a system template instead of controls. What components do I need to make this type of system secure? I have all of those components, my system, and I have them configured correctly. I'm going to be secure. We're almost done. I'm going to skip the demo to keep going. If we have time in the panel, I'll come back to the demo. The cool thing about this is I'm arguing that we're going to have machine-readable stuff. NIST has launched something called the Open Security Control Assessment Language effort. It's not even a prototype standard yet, but the idea is that we begin to have a standard. So there is effort to create a standard around this machine-readable assessments, et cetera, et cetera. So there's momentum here. That's the main message. There are a bunch of companies, and the last point that I want to make is, if you got all this, the other thing is that within the NIST risk management framework, more than 50% of the controls are actually organizational. They're policies, they're procedures, they're other things, so you can't get them just by inspecting the system. But the point is we can describe those other non-technical things as components as well. Our privacy policy is a component, and it can be described that way, et cetera. All right, and with that, we'll pass the mock and keep going. Thank you. To Nate.
Thanks, Greg. We probably could just let Greg speak the whole time. That was excellent and also very quick. So the fact that he kept it to 5 or 7 minutes is pretty awesome. So the next thing I'm going to touch on, and obviously we're going to have time for panel discussion and some questions, but leveraging what Greg just set the stage for is now focusing on how do you automate not only the controls process based on components of the system, but actually automating the component execution and the building out of that system itself. So as was referenced earlier, we have a program called Azure Security and Compliance Blueprint that is focused on both helping with current RMF ATO processes with customers who are moving to Azure, but then also working on modernizing, automating the ATO process and improving the overall approach that customers take in order to get their individual system level ATO on Azure. So how are we doing this? A lot of it is currently scenario-based architectures. So Greg talked about the individual components of the system. What we're working to create right now is reference architectures and then automated deployment templates that will actually deploy a holistic system onto Azure using infrastructure as code, security as code, compliance as code, pick your as a code, and will actually implement secure configurations for you. So that's taking the control response, which maps to that secure implementation, and just taking it a step further by saying, we leverage this template, so now we have all of these Azure services actually running, and then we also have the control mappings that are assigned to those individual services and components within Azure, which is the point that Greg was touching on. And I will go through this somewhat quickly as well. So we have multiple reference architectures that provide both supporting services, things that are going to provide your centralized auditing, logging, identity management, core networking capabilities, and all of this is available publicly online, so you can go and check this out, look at the architectures, download the templates, and in some cases you can actually deploy them directly into Azure depending on the framework and the individual architecture. So specifically to the Azure Gov part of the Azure Gov Meetup, we have specific templates that focus on FedRAMP Moderate, FedRAMP High, and then data analytics, a data warehouse, IaaS architecture, and a web app PaaS architecture. So that's our current inventory of FedRAMP-based solutions. All of these can obviously be customized or adapted, but they at least give you that starting point to say, if I'm leveraging primarily PaaS services, or if I'm primarily using data analytics, I can go in and use this as a starting point and have all of these pre-completed ATO compliance responses based on that specific architecture. And then another thing that I'll just touch on briefly is this is somewhat related to the controls piece as well. What we're also doing is integrating with Microsoft Compliance Manager, which will have two different pieces of this. One is the inheritance from Azure Gov that you get by virtue of being on the platform itself. So what is Microsoft doing on your behalf that you, quote unquote, do not have to worry about, but you can check on us and make sure that we're doing our due diligence there. And then also integrating those reference architectures and automated templates into Compliance Manager output. So currently it's in a spreadsheet. You can go and pull all of that out independently. We're looking to then tie that into Compliance Manager so it can be pre-populated based on the architecture that you select. And we are targeting lots of industries, but again, this is Gov, FedRAMP, DoD focus, so mostly the 853 content would be what you would be looking at.
Any more slides, Scott? You have any thoughts before we get into our conversation?
No, I'm going to spare everybody's slides.
So this is where we get to have a conversation with the three folks that are really knee-deep in getting ATOs. And in my role in doing cloud adoption in the federal market, this is probably the one place we we stay with our customers for way too long, and it kind of prevents us to get into production. So with that, I'll start with Scott. What is the biggest challenge you see with your customer space when it comes to ATOs?
I think I'd say it's consistency, because ATOs aren't approached the same way. You can go to one ISO in a large organization, and they'll literally go, that's great, I understand you have a FedRAMP ATO. Okay, I have 400 and some controls I need to fill out for FedRAMP High. Where shall we start? You hand them the blueprint, and they may or may not actually want to look at it. Eventually you'll get them to, because you're not going to feed it all to them. But you have other scenarios where you cross different types of cloud services. What happens when you want to use some infrastructure services with some platform services? Or what happens when, heaven forbid, you decide rather than installing an IaaS document management system, you're going to take the documents out of the system you built and store them in SharePoint Online. Now you've run into a boundary situation where you have an ATO for Azure, you have an ATO for Office 365. They're both FedRAMP compliant. But how do you actually deal with getting an ATO for that? And then your ISO says, fantastic, let's go ATO SharePoint Online. And you're like, what? I don't want an ATO SharePoint Online. I already did that. You accepted the FedRAMP ATO. And the problem is consistency, but the consistency is due to education. Because you've heard everybody talking about RMF, and the problem is everybody still thinks, or a lot of people still think, in the context of NIST RMF. So in the absence of complete guidance of how to do it better, how to use an approach that's modular and allows you to pull the controls in a way that makes sense. Oh, you're using Azure Backup? Oh, great, that fulfilled these 12 things for you. That's fantastic. But if you don't have a consistent way to do that, and it's a combination of three things. It's consistency, but that's due to education and a tool set that enables you to actually be able to execute on the vision of having the education and the consistency.
Anyone else want to take that before the next question? Nate?
I'll do one. Yeah, so one of the things that I see a lot is customers not being able to determine when they can move forward, because there's the ultimate catch-22 chicken and the egg of, I don't have my ATO, so I can't go build things. But particularly with cloud, it's new, it's not the same way they built the last system on-prem, the data center doesn't have an accreditation, so they get into, well, we can't build it because it's not secure, and we can't document the security because we haven't built it yet. So a lot of the conversations that I have are focused around, how do you get comfortable enough with the cloud environment to actually build out the system and architect it securely, so that you can then document all of the associated technical controls that are specific to that architecture. And a lot of customers get stuck there, and because of organizational problems and a myriad of issues, they ultimately get caught early in the process where they can't get there technically and they can't get there from a security standpoint, and they stagnate and just kind of end up churning and cycling on that.
So when you give them that advice, what do they typically do?
So one of the things that we do, and this is actually a separate program than the architectures and reusable content, is we have a program that we actually sit down with the customer, and one of the requirements for that program is to have all of the associated stakeholders engaged, to have a defined timeline for the ATO, to have necessary technical implementations in place, so that some of those more logistical, almost project management hurdles can be cleared, and you essentially try to get everyone, including Microsoft, at the table to work through those challenges and make sure that when you come across that roadblock, all of the people who need to contribute to a given solution or a given control response are involved to be able to do that.
So when you look at the Microsoft journey, we moved our entire enterprise to the cloud, and we started with probably the most easiest apps as our starting point. Is that part of your recommendation as well, as you get all those stakeholders together?
So part of this is based on mission owner, right? There needs to be somebody who has a desire to move. So For me, honestly, I look at it as we can do it either way, depending on what system is motivated, what individuals are motivated within the organization to make that happen. From the easiest standpoint, it's easy to get a quick win, and that certainly gives you a certain level of familiarity, which can set the groundwork for additional systems. But also doing something somewhat more difficult, if you have all the right stakeholders, now you don't come across challenges with subsequent systems that you haven't met before. So to me, it's more the mission owner and system owner motivation.
Greg, are you seeing any different challenges than mentioned earlier?
I agree with the challenges that were mentioned. I think one of the greatest challenges with the ATO process is the amount of information asymmetry that exists between the participants that are going through it. So in a nutshell, the security people really know security, but they don't know the IT system that the team is building, and there's no way they can keep up with it. The ISOs really know the risk management framework and the controls, but they also don't know the system. And the people that know the system the best, the developers, the engineers, have no idea what is going on with the risk management framework. And so we have this constant cycle of everybody having to learn all over again all the time. And so it's a separate conversation a little bit about how to correct that, but I think one of the things that helps a lot is recognizing that these information asymmetries exist rather than pretending that they don't. And so I think that that is one of just the simple information asymmetries.
So let me walk you through a common scenario. So we finally get our Azure platform ATO, and then there are thousands of apps that need their ATO following that. Then what happens in that scenario you just laid out?
Well, I think what Scott described is that some people say like, oh, okay, well, this is just on top of this of Azure, I get it. And other people say, oh no, this is a whole new system. The risk management framework treats everything as a bespoke system. I have to go at the start, and by the way, where's your MOU from Azure saying that they're actually implementing these controls, and how are we going to test them? And so then the problem that what he was describing becomes very quickly a problem because of not everybody is approaching it the same way. I think that, so let me back up again. It's really interesting if you read the risk management framework. The risk management framework starts with the executive of the agency, defining what the risk profile is of the agency and what's most important. The DoD is the only agency I know that has actually done that. Everybody else, every other executive passes security and compliance onto the security team. The security team has no idea what the priorities of the organization are, and therefore everything is exactly the same risk because it's their ass that's on the line. Mm-hmm. Because there hasn't been, and so I guess what I'm trying to say is the solutions to a lot of this stuff actually begin at the top of the organization, understanding what they're trying to accomplish and why they're trying to accomplish it, and not just passing it off to the subject matter experts. Because it's, again, information asymmetry, it's the executive at the agency that is the expert of the risks of the mission, not the security personnel.
So I actually get made fun of because every time the concept of I need an ISA MOU again comes through my email, everybody I work with ducks because I'm likely to throw something, because I've had to say this so many times. I keep a draft in Outlook that has a link to the FedRAMP tips and tricks cues thing, which Nate sent to me after it was published, that says you don't need this for FedRAMP CSP clouds. And the reason that's a problem is I actually had at one point a customer that said to me, I don't believe you that this is actually covered under your contract. Can you please take our ISA MOU form and map to your FedRAMP SSP the controls that cover these following things and reference the page numbers?
Thank you. I just spent $1.5 million going through, the FedRAMP service and had them come stare up every orifice, and now you're asking me
Right.
to go through your checklist.
Which, by the way, I'm contractually bound to be held to, because the customer has a contract with us. It's included in the FedRAMP that we're committing to in order to be able to do that. So we're in a position where that stuff is covered. So I would definitely agree with what Greg said. It's simply a case of evolution, and if you're lucky, you get a revolution and you get it all dealt with once. To Nate's point about the size of the app, I don't think small apps do it because there isn't the urgency unless it happens to be a small app that the head of the agency or some mandate is requiring. You've got to get something either big enough or important enough that somebody doesn't want it to fail or be late. And that's when you start figuring out where your ATO system breaks, because you end up busting through it. And that's what we've seen happen a few times. And then we typically, honestly, we take those things and archive them, the responses we get, and we send them back to the same people later when they block the next one.
I want to give a better answer to your question of, we've got Azure, now we have all of these other apps to do. Compliance isn't security. Compliance is about scaling good practices out to the entire organization. So that problem that you're describing is not a security problem. People force it into that space by thinking it's the risk management framework. It's actually an organizational change management problem. And so the right way to do it is to think about, how are we successful with change management in our organization? How do we put that in place in order to get everybody on the same page about our approaches? And sometimes that's with tools, sometimes it's with people, sometimes it's with processes, or a mix of them. But it's the problem. The compliance problem is not about. The compliance problem is, wait a second. How do I get everyone in this group to adhere to the good standard that we've chosen? And that differs from organization to organization, but it's change management. It's not technology. It's not the specifics of security. It's organization change management.
You mean the easiest part of any implementation?
That's right. Exactly. Yeah. Right.
So Nate, you were going to say contribute, or so if not, I have a question for you.
I'm good. I think those were both great responses.
Okay. So you're tasked to do an ATO. Where do you start?
I personally start with stakeholders and planning. I've seen it where there's an ISSO who's doing the ATO independently. I've seen it where the system is being built and then the ISSO is brought in extremely late in the process and told to document everything that exists. I think without having all of the folks within the organization engaged and having a good plan on how to execute with a definitive timeline, you're failing from the start, essentially. And you might get through it, but it's going to be longer and painful than if you got everybody engaged and had all of those stakeholders moving through the process together, as opposed to picking your chicken or picking your egg and then trying to go the other direction.
And then a little follow-up. Do you see people designing for ATO? Do they do it the other way around?
What do you mean the other way around?
Design for ATO.
Design the system for an ATO? I think that they choose to ignore choices of what system they're going to build and what tools they're going to use because of the ATO. I don't think that they design, so I guess I would say yes, they design for the ATO because they're like, oh, I can't even use that class of software because I have no idea how to ATO it. So I'm only going to work with this class of software.
I think we've seen that from pure IaaS to PaaS, where they say, oh, no, we can't do PaaS because we don't have an ATO for that, right? So let's not include PaaS services in this app.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the less well-known the implementation style is, using platform services, tying something like Power BI into something, what a great tool. You get to get your data in there, and then it does pretty much the rest of the stuff for you if you know how to pivot it. And you don't have to be a data scientist to actually go use it. So for simpler use cases, it works really well. The problem is you could try to go put an Excel spreadsheet into Power BI, and somebody might want you to get an ATO for that. If you put it on a file share, they wouldn't care. So there's this perspective of I don't know how to do it with that drives them to legacy architectures. Same thing with containers, microservices. How do you ATO microservices? And first off, if you're trying to restrict access to it, chances are the fact that the IP address it's tied to might move is going to give somebody really big headaches because it's just not built that way. So it's really, in ATOs and even in architecture altogether, the harder it is for you to wrap your head around it, the more likely you are to fall back. So ATOs is part of that overall picture of how you're going to choose that architecture.
So I do want to answer. I think that Nate was describing if you're in an organization or you have the organization, starting with the stakeholders, often you're the individual or there's just a couple of you or you're the team that's like, hey, you have to get this ATO done. And I think that the new model that we're looking at from an automation perspective is this idea, I don't begin with the controls, I begin with my components. What are I first make a list of the components that make up my system.
Can you give an example of a component?
Sure. I think increasingly, one of the things that we've recently learned is that if you're doing a website or something in the cloud, it always breaks into 4 tiers. Tier 1 is the cloud service provider. Tier 2 is the platform service provider. If there is a platform if there's another platform, those are the 2 tiers. The 3rd tier is the contractor who's building it, and the 4th tier is the agency itself, and maybe the 5th tier is the specific application like Drupal or Node or something. But there are always these different levels. And so you could almost say that you could say at one, those are my 5 components, right? Or you could break it down a little bit more and say, okay, I'm using these 5 different services in Azure, right? I'm using these 5 different services. What are these services that I'm using? Okay, let me go up to the next level. What are the things that I'm using within my organization? Like, am I using the organization privacy policy? Or do I have to write my own rules of behavior? So you make that list, and then you associate each of those components with control families. Which control family does each component map to? And then you can begin to go lower and lower in terms of, okay, which control does this map to, et cetera, et cetera. So now you've got a model of component to controls, and now you can think about how do I write up those descriptions? Those descriptions become reusable for other systems that you're building.
So I have plenty of other questions, but I do want to open up to the floor so we can have more of a dialogue here. So Mike?
Thanks, Karina. I'd like to go a little different than ATO. We had the Revamped TIC on the list, and that's a big challenge once you get into the cloud. The ATO is kind of before you get into it. I'm just curious what you guys think. I have other specific questions, but TIC 3.0 has been promised for several years now, and obviously it's not there. You guys talk about automation, DevOps. A lot of people talked about that, but how can you have DevOps and automation when you have to fill out 10 forms for the firewall request, the proxy request, the XSL exception request, et cetera, et cetera? You build that server, immutable architecture or container, but you have to go through all these processes that take 2 weeks. Guess what? It's not automated.
So I'll touch on that real quick, Mike. The thing I think we had TIC in the agenda here because we were hoping there'd be more release guidance now. As you've probably noticed, there isn't. When we look at TIC 2.0 and the reference architecture and Appendix H, the cloud side of things, what we see is that it is prescriptive. And it is not just what you need to do, it tells you how you need to do it. You must send your traffic this way. You don't meet a set of controls to a baseline, you meet a set of controls to a baseline this way. Our hope and our feedback from Microsoft's perspective has been, let's deal with the what. What do we need to do? Yes, we need to log access. We need to make sure that every denied attempt is logged, and we keep track of those. yes, we need to make sure that we're monitoring the network to understand what traffic's coming from, where it's coming through. The question becomes, why does that have to be performed by a device controlled by the agency if we can agree via accreditation that that data is provided to the agency? All of a sudden, the egregious mobility problem that the entire federal government has right now is largely addressed if we can provide that data back. So is that fully where they're going? I don't know. I think they are going to a scenario where they're going to try to be less prescriptive so that there'll be the ability to address the different modalities relative to Appendix H from there. But I don't want to really go any further than that because it's not me making the judgment call.
Appendix H, though, is quite old. It's 6 years old. And it only goes to a FISMA low in very certain scenarios, so some of them don't apply to mistakes.
Exactly.
So just real quick, I do want to say, I know you asked specifically about TIC, but I think Scott's main point of being outcomes focused, capabilities focused, and not really even control focused, like what's the true security impact, that's something we're also pushing from an overall regulatory standpoint outside of TIC as it relates to ATOs, security best practices, et cetera.
Hi, Ted Okada, CTO at FEMA again, and didn't want to, if there are any other Gov folks here, didn't want to overlap them, but we're going to put my disaster management hat on, right? So we don't get time back in a disaster, right? Velocity is everything for us at FEMA. So, Brock Long, our administrator, has given us a mandate in our third goal to reduce complexity in FEMA. So here's my bottom line. I need and want an ATO in 3 days or 1 day, okay? So that's my outcome. So this conversation that we're having right now is enormously important. And I think I speak for a lot of federal folks because we are loaded with technical debt because there are O&M overweight systems all over the place, right? So you mentioned it's all information asymmetry. That's absolutely correct. What's another way of describing information asymmetry? It's called moral hazard, right? If you look up moral hazard's definition is based on information asymmetry. You don't know the risk, right? So Alan Mullally was the former chairman of Ford. He said you can't manage a secret, right? Colin Powell said bad news doesn't get better with age, right? So this idea that, and we're fans, I'm a fan of open control and love the work that Initial, Pivotal, and Red Hat and John Jedney and Josh Timon did at Homeland Security, and they did. We're big fans of that. But we need an ATO in a day. And how do we get there as a community? And so it's a privilege to actually be here, and I'm grateful that Microsoft has put this event on, and you three specifically, because we need a solution. And whether it's more commits into open control on GitHub or something like that, let me finish. 2 questions here. First one is up and out, okay? And the second one is out. The first one is this. We can't move forward because when you think about the 8400A controls, it's almost like a 1,000-face Rubik's Cube, right, as you guys have correctly described. So how does NIST, and I had the privilege of interviewing Ron Ross, and we had an acquisition event, and I was on a one-on-one interview with him. How does NIST get there, and what does OMB's role play in getting NIST to even get an 800? Because I'm already thinking about how
first of all, we make Ron Ross write an SSP.
No, I got it. Sure, I got it. But sure, why not? But we've got we're looking at serverless, right, which is not even an 800-145. Right. Okay, so how do I look at service meshes and Istio and Kubernetes APIs into serverless? So there's a big challenge there because we don't even have that properly defined within NIST. How do we get the 800 controls to move in that direction, and the 8400 control, 8400A controls, somehow to rationalize everything that you said? So that's one process thing, because currently my FISMA score has to be manually entered. It's a manual process. NIST has a number of automated tools. I don't care if it's a Kafka feed or something like that. How do I actually automate this to get the 800J? That's the first question. Second question, I'll finish and I'll walk off, promise. Okay? This is exciting for me personally. Okay? So, second one is OSCAL. So we know that OSCAL is an emerging standard. Now, Microsoft is a part of a larger community, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, right, CNCF. How does the larger industry start to adopt OSCAL, start to evangelize it and widen it? So this is beyond the Beltway, right? So this becomes more of a national industry conversation. So we have larger numbers of players to help actually coax this process along. Thank you.
Well, so I think there was a lot there. So the good news is the past 2 or 3 years have been about tilling the soil and creating critical mass around the fact that we could automate the ATO. We could imagine things like ATO in a day or a few days or something like that. And we're now living a world where the cloud service providers are consistently providing something that gives us a automated, correct configuration of their environment. That's a big deal, and that exists. We now have a common reference point about the SSP document and automating that from open control, et cetera, so that exists. So we're at the starting gate. I would say the thing that is needed most right now, there are some things in process to begin to facilitate the creation of automation content to make it easier. So we could talk about that, would love to talk about the however, what we really need right now, I think in the community, is for individuals like yourself in government to say, this is the piece that we're going to all focus on at the same time. We're all going to focus on this one piece so that the commercial vendors can get cadence around what to address. Because right now, we're shooting at information asymmetry, moral hazard, all these different things. We are shooting at different targets to try to figure out what's going to get the elephant to move, right? And so we need a decision of, well, what do you want to get done? What are we going to focus on? Are we going to focus on the evidence? Are we going to focus on the control descriptions? Are we going to focus on building the content? Are we going to focus on the blueprints? Are we going to focus on the MOUs? Are we going to focus on producing these documents automatically so they can get signed off on? What are we all going to focus on so we can focus on it and we could do it? But what's happening is, if I walk in the door, oh, well, we've got to go talk to the CISO before we can use your, I've got to get an ATO on my software. You know? So, and it's, we all have, well, I think what I'm trying to say is, we need budget, we need focus, and then we'll rally around those points.
Wasn't FedRAMP supposed to help with all that?
Sorry?
Wasn't FedRAMP supposed to help with all that?
Well, FedRAMP did help with all of that. You know, in the world before FedRAMP, Azure would have had to go through the process with every single agency. We're still fighting over this MOU nonsense, but significant improvement to going to every single agency. FedRAMP is the only organization in the federal government that has figured out how to share an SSP and an ATO package. There is no other agency that knows how to share an ATO package with any other agency. So there are shortcomings, but in many ways, FedRAMP has moved the ball forward. You know, but at the same, and people are, in fact, I guess the other thing is, I'm getting wound up. So
deep breath.
Mark was talking about trust and trusted identity. The truth of the matter is that overall, FedRAMP has a trusted identity. And in fact, people are starting to, I only want to use something that has been through FedRAMP. And that is, as I think about it, that's the way that the trust model is supposed to work. You set up you set an authority, people rally around that authority, and we can improve the workflow of it, et cetera, but, you know.
And to go beyond that, when you have a FedRAMP ATO, what they're doing is declaring that your service is worthy of a certain amount of trust. So what they're actually doing is providing a platform for trust.
So,
Do you need a mic? We couldn't hear what you said.
I'm sorry, what I was trying to say without the microphone was that what FedRAMP is doing with the PATO is also allowing the service provider to have the accreditation authorization for what's now a trustworthy service. And that level of trust and the enforcement by FedRAMP of the commitments under contract is a very valuable thing if the PATO is sufficient for the agency needs.
So you have a question in the back?
I do. I kind of have a comment and a question. So I am a Microsoft partner and a CSP, and we do implementations facilitating the ATO process for customers on behalf of Microsoft, and also the DISA cap and those other concerns. But I spent my formative years breaking into DoD critical infrastructure. So this concept of compliance and the way that we approach it is really from an adversarial mindset, an optimal environment for me, because I know exactly what you're going to do, the controls that are going to be applied. And the reality is that I think there's a disconnect with the risk management framework and the reality of risk management, of the identification of what is critical and what potential threats should be the design basis for the infrastructure, both from a physical and a cyber perspective. So we talk about trusted networks and even potentially blockchain verification of identity, but that prevents us really from being able to, with the blockchain example, to be able to track what individuals do in the vein of ATA and ATP to create a signature to identify diversion from the norm to be able to determine if there's an insider threat. So I think there's a lot of discussion around how to make this something that we can do more rapidly, that we can do more effectively. The reality is there's so many different missions within the ecosystem and so many different technologies that Microsoft has been implementing and is still in the process of getting ATO for, that the mission owners have to take more responsibility and realize that the RMF is not really risk management. The RMF is a process that relies on risk management having been done when they start to apply those controls. So I'd love your guys' thoughts about what Microsoft is doing already to be able to implement technologies to address some of those other really threats that should be the design basis for, and the basis for the whole FedRAMP Plus, DISA cap, permission to connect process.
So I'll take the first crack at that. I think one of the things, if we look at an old RMF style thing, you document the controls you've implemented. What happens when somebody changes them a week later? The config changed. So we run into a situation where you don't just have to be in a position where to truly protect the environment, it's security and compliance. It's not the same thing, right? So your compliance is controlled by RMF and you document those things. But if you've not been able to control your configuration and have a desired state for the configuration that's documented and either hopefully automatically remediated or at the very least reported on so you know exactly what it is, that makes it difficult there just to keep track of what's going on. In terms of what we're doing about that, we have desired state stuff built into Azure now, which gives you the ability to start doing some of those things. That's one little piece. There's no silver bullet for this. It's piecing together the capabilities and components of a platform that allow you to meet what you want to do. And part of the challenge there is you have a bunch of stuff that's legacy. Some of your legacy stuff is still going to use legacy style managements for security and identity and some of those things there. So it's not a wholesale, I'm going to go cloud native on everything now, because it's not going to do some of the things you need for your older systems. But as you go there, you start having cloud style scenarios where you have advanced threat analytics, you have advanced threat protection, where you're now using the cloud and you're taking heuristics and learnings that are from not just your environment, but the cloud as a whole in an abstracted fashion that allow you to apply machine learning style scenarios to understand that's wrong because it doesn't look like everybody else. So I need to tell you what that is. And so we're building some of that stuff into the platform. If you look at Azure Security Center, some of the other things that are happening there, we're evolving that space. But this is the cloud. We can't wait until there's a perfect comprehensive solution for everything. We're going to give you the pieces as quickly as we can so you can do as much as you can to protect your environment. That's why you guys get to have fun now.
Yeah, just as a stat, when we release a new service about every 38 hours. So that's how, and it's going to get even
Right.
faster than that. So
This is why it's fun for you guys. There's always new stuff to learn.
So I'm checking on time, and the elevators stop at 8:30, just so you know. So I just wanted to close with going back to a question that wasn't answered about OSCAL and how Microsoft intends to, I don't know if you want to repeat the question.
CNCF, and how do you conflate hostile and begin to have that conversation in the language?
Yeah, so I think Greg kind of touched on it in his response, although it obviously wasn't specific to Microsoft. And that is one of the things that we've looked at as far as, obviously Greg has GovReady, OSCAL, Open Control, all of these different things. We actually had a partner, Docker, build a blueprint template on Open Control using our blueprint content. So like for us, that was great. It was a great example of how that can be leveraged for a platform type provider on top of another CSP. The biggest thing for us has been getting the demand signals for where is it that we can be most effective in helping our customers, because
That's a better way of saying than what I did. Yeah.
Well, no, but essentially,
right. Where's the
when you're
demand
talking
signal?
about hitting the right target, it's
Right.
we want to understand what will be most effective, as opposed to putting an egg in every single basket and then waiting to the end to see which basket ends up being the right one. So, certainly any feedback on that would be more than welcome, and we're certainly staying aware and engaged about where that stands.
So with that, I know there are tons of other questions, but we wanted to give a little time for networking, and the speakers will be around. If you have questions, you can ask them.